There are stable trait-like individual differences in fatigue susceptibility that significantly affect performance. Let's see the results. Well, a lot of people think that's true. And that's nice because Dr. Joe Chandler from the Naval Medical Research Unit in Dayton, Ohio, is going to talk to you about individual differences in fatigue susceptibility profiles.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry to be speaking to you in the middle of the circadian nadir for all of us at this moment. So I also know that we're behind schedule, so I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible. The first thing I want to do is say that most of my job has already been done by the fantastic presentations that we have sat through already this week. We've heard from our friends in the German Air Force about caffeine and adenosine and the individual differences in caffeine effects. We heard earlier in this week, actually toward the start, from Master Sergeant King about an application of biomathematical modeling for predicting fatigue and trying to mitigate some of its effects through scheduling. We've heard from a couple of people from NASA, Dr. Bendrick, Mr. Brian Smith, about practical application of these very challenging questions. And yesterday we heard from my colleague Dr. Lynn Caldwell for an overview of essentially what we can do about it, because the number one thing we can do is sleep, but that is not always and actually very rarely possible. The two things that I want to focus on for the next couple of minutes are two things that Major General Robb and Major General Travis told us yesterday. General Robb showed us the schematic, which was fantastic, with all those planes on one side and then just a couple of aircraft on the other side. And I'm a statistician and a research psychologist, and the first thing that popped into my head was, whoa, we have to change the way we're answering these questions. Fundamentally have to change the way we're answering these questions. We can't use group average statistics anymore because we're not looking at groups. We're looking at people. So what that told me is that our margin for error has gone down, and it wasn't big before. Now our margin for error is like that. So we have to be able to capture, measure properly what's going on with the individual at the individual level. And then General Travis told us that we have to select right and train right. Selecting right is all about measuring right from my perspective. My job is to feed proper information to you guys, to the docs. I have to be able to say I am confident that the information that I'm giving you is proper and complete. And when we talk about the way we usually run statistics for trying to predict stuff, we don't really do that most of the time because we use generalized stats and we ignore the tails. We look at the average and we ignore the tails. So I'm going to try to convince you that we should be paying attention to those tails, especially when it comes to our fatigue susceptibility profiles from sleep loss. So next slide, please. This is me and not anybody else. I like the way Lynn said that yesterday. Next slide, please. Okay, why it's important is already done for me, although I promised a colleague I would summarize it this way. One of the people I work with, Dr. Beth Hartzler, who is a very intelligent individual, said fatigue is bad. Yes, it is. That's all we have to say there. So we're going to talk about what these individual differences mean, and then some of the correlates. Some of the things we've already identified to tell us that these profiles, I know the question was a little odd, but they are stable and they are trait-like. And I call them trait-like because it's difficult to establish a causal factor this early on. And then the take-home message is that we need to take these things into account. It's really simple as that. Next slide, please. Fatigue impairs performance and contributes to mishaps. Next slide, please. All right, so to this point, we have used averaging of performance statistics for a good reason. The stats that most of us are familiar with in this room are based on the general linear model. We look for the mean. We use lots and lots of numbers. More samples are better. Higher sample size, better. Gives us more information, more power. It gives us the best information about the most people. Well, the problem with averaging these fatigue statistics is that we're missing the interesting and potentially dangerous people on the tails. The folks that can stay awake for 18 hours and look just like they did performance-wise 12 hours ago, and the people who after 12 hours you don't want them making you a piece of toast because they will burn themselves and make you bad toast. We don't want that. We need to pay attention to those folks. We also do it in terms of the type of sleep deprivation. I'm not going to get into that one today, but I do want to briefly mention it. We talk about acute total sleep deprivation as one thing, and chronic sleep debt, which is much more common. Every single one of us in this room right now has a sleep debt. They behave differently, but we treat them the same. The individual example is what I want to talk about. So we should not be averaging across folks, and I'll show you why. Next slide, please. When you look at a performance graph in fatigue, this is what you see most of the time. This is the psychomotor vigilance task. It's been brought up a couple of times here so far this week. Major Woodford, a little while ago, demonstrated to us the importance of half a second. The difference being you're either crashing the aircraft or you are saving the aircraft. Well, the PVT calls a lapse any time that you don't respond to that little red light for more than half a second. So here, this is just keeping people awake for about 24 hours in a row. That's not that huge of an insult. This is typically what you see. Goes up and down, you can see a little bit of circadian rhythmicity, and then by the time you get to that dip, and you've been awake for a long time, at 0300 hours the next day, you're looking at 4 half seconds missed. It only takes 1. You're looking at 4 on the average. Next slide. When we plot that to try to explain this to other people, we get this beautiful straight line, and that's what we like to show folks. But look at the gap. Look at the fit between the line and then what's happening, all except for that key point right there at 0300. That is a lot of missing information. That is a lot of information that we can't miss, that we can afford to miss. So let me show you the same stats, but using an individualized approach. So next slide, please. These are the same people. Okay? Don't pay attention to the scale there on the x-axis because that's a group mean centered variable, but you can treat the progression of time as going from left to right, similarly to what you just saw on the last slide. These people fall out into these beautiful groups of fatigue susceptible, and look at this. Now these really are the half-second lapses. 9.20 lapses in a 10-minute period. That's not cool if you're trying to do anything important. 2 of those people, you don't want them doing this for you. Most people fall, and most of us, actually, I usually get to say most of us in here probably fall in the middle. That's not true because I'm speaking to a bunch of very highly motivated pilots and flight docs, so most, you're probably a little closer to fatigue resistant. But look at the tails. Fatigue resistant, these people look just about the same as when they started. These are people that we could, in theory, ask a little bit more out of. The people who are fatigue susceptible are the people who we could, in theory, either train up or better select for in terms of what their demands are. So next slide, please. What's it mean? You're going to get tired of me saying this within the next couple of minutes. This is all I mean. Adding measurements sensitive to individual differences makes us better at predicting the consequences of fatigue due to sleep loss. Better prediction equals better prevention and management. Better prevention and management equals fewer mishaps. That's the bottom line. So let's look at this a little more closely with an applied example. Next slide. This is the FAST, which is a fantastic tool. The FAST does an amazing job of helping us schedule in the here and now. What you're looking at is me plotting the predicted FAST scores of when people are going to get bad against when they actually get bad in these same data, just about a day spent awake. The outcome variable, again, is PVT lapses. If I look at what FAST predicts and then what actually happens, FAST predicts about 14% of the variance in those lapses. Now, for a model, that is fantastic. When I take 2 of the measures that we've tested over and over again in my lab, one of them is a simple divided attention task, and one of them is a measure of eye speed, saccadic velocity, while you're tired. I put those into the basic model, and I more than double the predictive ability of FAST. And this is not with any of the more advanced biomathematical modeling that has to happen after this, and I'm going to leave that up to the smarter folks. All I did was enter this into a regression and see what variance was accounted for, and it more than doubles it. That's because now I'm paying attention to the people on the tails. Next slide. So here are the potential causes and correlates. All of these things are exploratory in nature at best, and they're all correlations. I'm going to show you a slide on genetic factors, but I'm not a geneticist. So I'll leave those to you to dive into a little bit more. We're going to talk about genetic factors, which is why we call them trait-like, baseline cortical activity, relationship with personality, age, and occupation. Next slide, please. So, people have been looking now for the last couple of decades for fatigue genes. And when you get into genomics, the degree to which I understand it is you can find a piece of the puzzle, and that's very exciting, but the picture is always much, much more complicated than that. But we have identified, especially by kind of backtracking through things we had already identified for circadian rhythmicity, that there are differences that are at the very basic level of the way our brain handles being awake. The first one speaks to how quickly we get rid of an adenosine buildup, which we heard about from our friends in the German Air Force. The second one was a circadian rhythm gene that we thought only did circadian rhythm, which we're all suffering from right now. I had to stand up before my presentation and kind of jog in place for a minute. There are differences there. There may even be differences in the immune response. There's a whole group of people out there that you could talk to that would tell you that this is because of a buildup of systemic inflammation. Well, there are differences that are stable and trait-like that essentially point to the fact that people deal with fatigue in terms of their systemic inflammation differently from one another, and that they may map on to those three groups that I showed you just a second ago. Next slide, please. Baseline cortical activity. This has to do actually more with personality than anything else. So higher cortical activity while rested and while you're just sitting there equals better performance during acute total sleep deprivation compared to low cortical activity. Now, this depends very heavily on where you're looking. Mostly this is in the prefrontal cortex. And the expression, the behavioral expression, which I think, at least from my background, is a little more interesting to me, is the next slide, please, is personality. So you get a bunch of extroverted people in a room and you put them through a sleep deprivation profile, and they're going to talk to one another because they need that external stimulation. When you look at them rested and alone, they don't have the same type of baseline cortical activation as an introvert, because the introvert is thinking about their own thing up in their head. So they're spending all their energy talking to folks, though they become more fatigue susceptible at that point, while the introverts are not affected by the social context because their baseline cortical activity that's higher is likely due to them just sitting there and processing all sorts of stuff without having to have anyone else in the room. Next slide. Age. This is a divisive one, but response times for older subjects decline at a slower rate than for younger adults. At first that seems like a little bit of a counterintuitive result until you look at the converse of it. Performance is recovered more quickly for younger adults. But the thing that we need to know as an operational community is that younger adults were less aware of or less willing to report the degree of their impairment. One thing that I don't have up here on a slide or a graph or anything like that, people are terrible at judging how impaired they are when they're tired. Subjective assessments don't cut it. And young people are worse than folks who know themselves a little better as they get older. Next slide, please. Profession. I'm looking out at two professions that probably have a whole bunch of fatigue-resistant people in them. And in fact, the example that I have up here is pilots. Pilots are more fatigue-resistant than non-pilots, but when you look at that snapshot, there's still a variation. All of the studies that I base those original graphs on were for student naval aviators that were coming through the pipeline for U.S. naval aviation over the last 2 years. And they still broke up into those groups. Those groups didn't suffer the same way a civilian population would, but they still broke up into those groups. Next slide. So here are the next steps. I told you it'd be a quick talk. we need to understand the task-specific nature of fatigue profiles. If you talk to 10 different fatigue researchers, they will give you 10 different answers for what working memory means, what memory means, what performance means. You don't even want to get onto performance, because the ecological validity problem of does pressing a button on this box make me better or worse at flying an aircraft is just a problem you don't want to touch. What we do need to touch, though, is the idea that one person may look fatigue susceptible on a basic task while they're not fatigue susceptible on a more complex task, and vice versa. And so what we need to do as an operational community is to identify the most important applied areas and come up with a nomenclature that we can all use to communicate. When you dive into this literature, it's a very rich, it's a fascinating literature. Of course, I have to say that because it's my job. But it's a very rich literature. You get 10 different papers with 10 different definitions, and it doesn't do you any good. We have to start taking steps to get on the same page, to say, if this is reaction time with the PVT, why is that important? Well, we have to operationalize that half a second lapse, and why that matters. We need to specify domains of performance rather than individual tasks, and we've got to stop fighting over which individual task best captures this one concept. I loved, as I'm sure we all did, listening to Colonel Ling sit up here and tell us, get to the results, get to the results, get to the results, get to the results. And I'm a scientist. I like to sit in my lab and go, and push my glasses up and then try to tell you guys something later on. But we've got to get to the results, especially in fatigue. We've got all this great information. It's time to come to a consensus, add in this information that we have been missing, and take the next step. We've done a lot of good stuff. FAST is a fantastic tool as an example. We can make it better. We can do that with a factor analytic approach, which is the last thing. Next slide, please. Take-home message. In my personal and professional opinion, there are stable, trait-like individual differences in fatigue susceptibility. These differences can and do impact performance in a way that matters. Adding measurements sensitive to individual differences makes us better at predicting the consequences of fatigue, and then that basic formula at the end, better prediction from us, the information we're trying to feed you guys, better prediction equals better prevention and management, better prevention and management equals fewer mishaps, and that's why we're all here. Next slide. That's it. Any questions?
Okay, so get the clickers out, because before he started, already 80% of you agreed with him. Let's see if that changed after the talk. Let's see what the results are. Ooh, 10%. You convinced them.